Welcome back to On the Line. In today's episode, we are doing our second part of our interview with John D. Davidson. Last week, we really focused on some of the main points of his thesis that he put forward in this book. This week, we're going to unpack that at a little bit of a deeper level. Particularly, we're going to focus on transhumanism and AI. And I really, really encourage you to stick around for that part of the interview. That takes place probably around about an hour into the video. But that is very eye-opening as far as the demonic influence that can take place and is in many ways taking place in some of these new technological advancements. So this is probably one of my favorite conversations I've had, to be honest. This is just a great dialogue. We talk about Lewis, Tolkien, some of these very pressing, dangerous issues that are plaguing the church and all of us who call ourselves Christians. So I very much hope that you enjoy this. And as always, if you can simply like this video, share this with friends who you think this would be a good message for them to hear. That really helps us get our message across and makes a difference within the Christian landscape. So thank you for being part of our audience and enjoy. All right, and Bennett says we're live. Welcome back to On the Line, guys. And we are back with John Davidson for the second week in a row. So we are talking about your book, Pagan America, which once again, we highly recommend. It's a fantastic book, which is why we're taking 2 full episodes to kind of walk through some of these ideas and the implications it has on Christians living in kind of the Western world today. For those that did not watch the first episode, this episode can certainly stand alone, so you certainly don't have to exit here. But if you want to go get some more context on some of the things that we talk about, you can go back to our previous episode, which you'll be able to find on our channel. But I just want to jump into maybe John, if you can just give like a 60-second synopsis that kind of gets people that haven't seen the first episode up to speed on just the thesis of the book.
Yeah, the basic argument of the book is that America was founded as a Christian country. That is, it requires a Christian people to have our republican form of government, to maintain self-government. And as we become a post-Christian people, we're going to lose a lot of those core features of American government and American society and American way of life. And the post-Christian era is not going to be this secular, liberal utopia. It's not going to be this atheist paradise. The post-Christian world is going to be a neo-pagan world, right? Mm-hmm. The idea being that the alternative to Christianity isn't secular humanism. It's a new form of paganism. Mm-hmm. And that's emerging in our time. And so the book kind of like goes through trying to like tease out these new forms of paganism and how they like fit into what American society is becoming.
Mm-hmm. So one of the chapters I enjoyed the most, mostly because, I mean, you can see one of the books we have up there every single time is Lord of the Rings, right? So Tolkien's works, Lewis, Chesterton, Dorothy Sayers, some of these writers that were right around this time, fascinatingly, they saw this, right? They saw this coming. And particularly Lewis, you point on in chapter 4, I think it is, right? The materialist magician.
Yeah,
is that right?
Chapter 5, yep.
Chapter 5, yeah. And it's he's very much aware of these kind of movements and where it's going. And he's very prophetic in some of these kind of the interconnection between the spiritual realm and their desire to kind of enslave humanity, right? And bring them back into that pagan type structure, which is the demonic type structure of human civilization. And as they're trying to play this out, how people cooperate and are deceived and become participants in that. And you kind of really lay that out. So if you just want to walk us through a little bit of that.
Yeah, even the phrase for chapter 5, the title of chapter 5 is called The Rise of the Materialist Magician. And that phrase, materialist magician, I took from C.S. Lewis's book, Screwtape Letters. And famous book for those that don't know, Screwtape Letters is an epistolatory novel that takes the form of a series of letters that this demon Screwtape writes to his nephew demon Wormwood, right? And Wormwood is assigned a person to try to damn to hell, right? To tempt and to enslave. And Wormwood asks Screwtape a question about whether or not it is the demon's policy to remain hidden or to reveal ourselves. And Screwtape responds that for now, our policy is to remain hidden, because if we reveal ourselves, then we cannot make materialist skeptics out of mankind. We, in other words, if we reveal ourselves, we kind of reveal the existence of the supernatural world, and we want to keep. I'm paraphrasing, obviously. In the book, I quote directly from Lewis. He says, we want to keep people in a state of materialist skepticism so that their mind will remain closed to belief in God, right? Which Screwtape calls the enemy, right? God is the enemy to these demons. And he says, so for now, our policy is to remain hidden. He's like, but we look forward to a time in the future when we can create a new kind of man, a materialist magician. And he's like, several developments on this front, may be promising on that regard. And the idea is to maintain in mankind a fundamentally materialist worldview, a skeptical worldview, but introduce elements of psychoanalysis and sexual obsession and astrology and tarot card reading that invites man to engage with what he calls spiritual forces while refusing to acknowledge the spiritual beings behind the forces. And he said, if we can achieve this amalgamation of the materialist on the one hand and the magician on the other, a secular rationalist who rejects God but accepts the existence of spirits or spiritual forces while not worshiping them, then we will have created the materialist magician. And if we can do that, then the end of the war will be in sight, the enslavement of humanity.
So they're able to have both sides.
Yes. So you would manage to hoodwink people into rejecting God, but accepting essentially worship of devils. And so I call the chapter "The Rise of the Materialist Magician" because I open it by talking about the growing popularity on social media, particularly TikTok, of witchcraft, and especially among young women right now. There's this burgeoning interest in witchcraft, but it's not like it's sort of like witchcraft for the TikTok set. I call it moral therapeutic paganism, right? Following Rod Dreher's moral therapeutic deism. And it's very much tied up with identity and feminism and, living your own best life, and sort of like this empowerment witchcraft, but it's, so it takes on the kind of the trappings of identity politics, identity affirmation and feminism, and female empowerment. But at the same time, they're opening themselves up to, real spiritual forces. And they believe, and they're not wrong to believe, that there's real power behind it, right? That can affect things in their life, their circumstances, in their world. And so they see themselves as tapping into a source of power, obviously, like in their mind for good, right? And even name like certain like familiars, and like will invoke pagan gods of the past. So like this one teenage girl in Texas that the Washington Post profiled a year and a half ago is cites as her. She's a TikTok influencer, a witchcraft influencer. Cites as her familiar Hecate, ancient Greek goddess.
Okay.
Right now,
so she's using that name as she does these things. Like that's part of her.
Yes, and she's identifying Hecate as her like patroness or whatever.
Okay.
And her boyfriend is into this stuff too, and his familiar is Odin, right?
Okay.
The Norse god Odin. So they are explicit about the fact that they are like reaching out to these beings for like guidance. And they disclaim any notion that they're worshiping them. They're like, it's not like worship. It's more like, a partnership.
Yeah.
And it's like, I couldn't have like come up with a better example of what Lewis was describing in the Screwtape Letters than what these like teenage young people were talking about as they described their practice of witchcraft.
Don't you say, like, in the piece, they kind of even they still mock Christianity and
Yes.
organized religion, and they'll say, well, they've got that blind faith and they worship God and whatnot. So we're very rational. We don't buy any of that, but at the same point, they're still engaging in these spiritual things with gods. They don't call it worship because they want to still be in charge, but the point is that them being in charge is actually a facade, right?
Yeah, because they want to. Because just like Screwtape says, their mind is closed to belief in God, so they don't say what they're doing is praying to these creatures. That they're it's more that they're like journeying with them or whatever. What kind of therapeutic kind of narcissistic language that they employ there. But as I say in the book, whatever it is that they say they're doing, they are calling on a demon, so as Christians, we believe that stuff is real, and so, and by the way, like Hecate and Odin are not like nice figures. Like if you look them up, like these aren't harmless beings, right? Obviously. So these young people are getting, are falling into the trap that Lewis describes in the Screwtape Letters. And it's part of a larger process of kind of like, we talked about this in the last episode, the disfigurement of reason, because these same teenagers will say, oh, I'm not like, I'm not superstitious. I believe in I believe in science and stuff like that, but at the same time, I'm also going to like burn sage and like come up with this potion, and do all this stuff that's like totally has, is totally foreign to the Western scientific mind.
Yeah.
But they are creating an unstable admixture of spiritualism and sort of like Western materialism, and so these are the materialist magicians that Lewis describes. And as I got into this, I started sort of digging in deeper to the abolition of man and Lewis's book, That Hideous Strength, which That Hideous Strength is sort of the novel version of the abolition of man, which is really just an exploration of what happens to people when you reject what Lewis calls the Tao, which is like basically natural law, and objective morality, a belief in objective truth, right? Once you reject the Tao and you reject you reject the ability to judge right and wrong or any like objective standards for right and wrong or true and false. And once you do that, you step out into the void, right? Beyond all reason.
Because doesn't he kind of go? So I mean, because to your point, like the Tao, right? And he actually does kind of an interesting job of, he doesn't even just bind that to Christianity, which of course he's a Christian, but he's saying in any of these,
he's trying to be ecumenical, so he calls it the Tao.
Yeah,
because it's like any objective moral truth.
Objective moral truth that's coming from above, and the point with that is everyone has to be subservient to that. Whether you're King David, whether you're the president, whether you're the lowest, everyone is supposed to. They ought to. I think that's one of his big things, at least in mere Christianity. He'll say the big thing with morality is you say you ought to do this. Well, why ought I do this? Well, because something more powerful has told us that we are supposed to do this. And then civilization kind of builds itself around that objective morality. Yeah. And the point is they're trying to undermine that and say there is no such thing as that. And then therefore, well, what's going to take its place, right? And that's where that's where the book moves forward, right?
Yeah, exactly, right. And a great embodiment, literary like exposition of this idea is in Lewis's book, That Hideous Strength, which is for those who have read it, but there's like this group. The setup is that there's this group of scientists in this organization called the NICE or NICE, kind of a funny deal.
Yeah, I love how he does that.
And they are kind of charged with a group of like sociologists and psychologists and ecologists and other experts, right? And they are given the charge to kind of completely re-engineer, this part of the English countryside as like a little experiment, and they have ambitions to completely revolutionize English society and social relations and everything else, and reorganize them along rational lines. And these guys are presented, and they see themselves as like totally rational, like materialist scientific experts who are going to like overcome all of the old or going to, shepherd along the rustic English peoples with their Christian prejudices and superstitions, and sweep all that away and create like a new man and a new form of society that's organized along rational lines. And that's kind of like the setup. And as you go through the story, you come to find out that this organization of scientists is not what it seems to be, and that the real project is something other than this kind of like social science experiment about reorganizing, making a society more efficient, and that the what's really happening is that these scientists they think they have figured out how to reanimate this severed head, and they believe that they are going to like create a new god, a new form of a god, and that they're going to really revolutionize like all of human civilization and reorganize it not along rationalist scientific lines, but according to this new power that they think they have like unlocked,
that they think they've created, and that they would have control over,
and that they would think they've created this godlike intelligence and this reanimated severed head, and that would be the new god, and that they're creating God, right? In reality, because as the story goes, you go even deeper, you realize that all of their scientific instruments and knowledge is not what's animating the head. The head is being animated by a demon, that only a few people at the very top of the organization know the truth, which is that but even the demons they refer to as macrobes as opposed to microbes, that there are these like macro organisms, interdimensional beings that are out in space, and we're serving them, right? And it's through the supernatural powers of these macrobes that this head is being animated. And of course, in the end, the scientists all like lose their minds and slaughter each other because the head tells them to, and they do whatever the head says. And so it's the brilliant exposition of the collapse of the materialist worldview, brought about by a radical departure from this sense of the Tao, or objective reality and objective morality, and that also is what the abolition of man is about. It just comes at it in slightly a different way.
Well, I think you even pulled from a quote, because we talked about this before, but I wrote my master's thesis on that hideous strength, right, and trying to draw some of these aspects out, and you did a much better job of it in the book. But you pulled from one of the quotes, which is one of my favorite quotes, and I don't even know where I could direct you, Bennett, to pull it up. So I'll just if you can pick it up, great. If not, that's okay. But he basically goes along the lines of, and this is in the third part of it, right? And he says that man uses technology in order to have control over other men, and they do so by replacing the morality, right? So it ends up being that the masses are kind of controlled by these new conditioners, right? Which is just kind of this elite, and then the elite are now creating this new morality, which we're going to hash out here, right? I mean, that's something as we draw into what we see now, we see how Lewis is very prophetic in this. But then he says, but what are those people ruled by? And he says, in the end, they're ruled by the same thing. All people are ruled by if they don't have this objective law, this natural law that can be systematized. And that is, they're just ruled by their own stomachs, right? They're just by their
emotions, whims.
Yeah.
Right. This is just capricious will is really all. And that's what the conditioners, I think he says at one point, kind of become our tormentors. Yeah. Right. Because it's just, it's feckless, inchoate desire and impulse, that is the standard by which the new conditioners will act, because they're unmoored from any like real sense of right and wrong, in any objective sense of even reality, right? I think I do quote that part, and it's a great part of I think the abolition of man. And that is reflected in these characters in that hideous strength, these scientists who sort of like, once they reject the Tao and step out into the void, they kind of devolve into madness, because they cease to. One of them, he describes, he had ceased to believe in reality, right? Because his mind
withers, right?
Yeah,
and the point, I love his play on words, right? In other words, like his mind has withered,
right?
So his name is Withers,
and he couldn't accept the idea that something like thought was real, right? That rationality was real. So it's like if you once you go down this road, of rejecting objectivity and objective reality, then you come to a place where you reject even something as basic as like rational thought, you know, and it drives, and it in the case of the novel, it drives these, not to ruin it for everybody, but it drives them crazy. They go insane, and bad things happen.
Yeah.
But the initial desire, kind of the way in, is and you know, I talk about Tolkien in the same vein, because his works deal with this as well. The way in is like this desire to sort of to transcend natural law and to transcend you know, received wisdom and revelation, to transcend morality, and clean up the messiness of the human condition, right? You know, ends in madness, and like absolute evil, right? And in the Silmarillion and in the Lord of the Rings, Tolkien explores this in the person of Sauron, right? Who's similarly repelled by the disorder in Middle Earth, and he wants to bring order to it. And you know, it's kind of almost sees what he's doing as like, he sees himself as like the rightful ruler of Middle Earth, because he's the only one powerful enough that can bring order to the chaos of it all.
Yeah.
Right?
So they don't like because I think one of the characters in that Hideous Strength very much opposes, you might remember his name, Philostrato maybe, but he very much opposes, he hates like organic life.
Yes.
Because organic life is like, it's messy, right? And it's just, and it's
dirty,
out there, dirty. So he wants to like sterilize all of that, because sterilization is something where you can control.
Right.
Right. There's nothing that can even crawl on you.
Right.
So you have that full control, you have that full order, but in the process, you've actually bankrupted life itself.
Yes.
Right. So it's this love for non-existence is really what it is.
Right. Yeah. And a rejection too of like the givenness of the created order. Right. And the kind of the contingency of existence, you know, and a desire to impose total control, you know, over what is a given order, you know, and even to like perfect it, you know, to see, and in the aggrandizement of oneself, right, to and one's powers to try to perfect this thing, and in Philostrato's case, you know, to get rid of all organic life on Earth completely, you know, and get rid of all human like relations and transcend humanity itself, right?
Yeah.
And you hear people talking like that now, right?
Yeah. Well, which is interestingly, like that's Lewis's point in even that quote. Like as it gets to the end, I think he says, "Man's conquest of nature in the end becomes nature's conquest of man," right? And that what actually makes man is that they're made in God's image, right? So they are an outflow of this natural order and this ordered life according to the way that God has structured it.
And we have a reason because God has reason. So our reason is a reflection of the divine intelligence.
Yeah. But so when you push back against that, what's left? Nature, which controls the belly of man, right? His lusts or his desires. Right. That's what rises up. But what else is rising up from below? The wielder of that, the one who has kind of control over that, which is kind of this demonic or this satanic control,
the rulers and principalities of the earth,
and their desire is to destroy life.
Yeah,
the creation that God has made and all of its complexity and its interchange, like this beautiful complexity that God has.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And that was Sauron's desire too in Middle Earth, that he in a way he hated the world that Eru Ilúvatar, which is who's the god in Tolkien's Legendarium, you know, the one god. He hated Middle Earth, and he hated the freedom that the peoples of Middle Earth had, and the disorder that, as he saw it, of the world, and sought to conquer it, right? And it sort of consumed him, right, with a rage, and he ended up like hating the things that he like attained control over, right? You know, the peoples that he did control, and everywhere the shadow, you know, like the shadow ended. He ended up being reduced to a being of like pure will and malice, right? And hating everything that he encountered, right? Yeah. And seeking to destroy it. So yeah, like just as you say, like, yeah, Lewis put it well, that man's desire to conquer nature ends in nature conquering man. So that even the conditioners as he said, won't have any basis on which to do anything other than their just like capricious appetite.
So before we tease this out a little bit into how this plays out now, I just want to geek out a little bit. I think you're making me understand Tom Bombadil for the first time, right? Because Tom Bombadil, for those that haven't read The Lord of the Rings, because it's not in the movie, he's a character in the books, but he's a very important character.
Yeah.
And Frodo, Sam, Merry Pippin, they meet him very early on, and he's just he's in this. It's not Fanghorn; it's one of the other forests that they're going through.
The Barrow Downs.
Yeah, and he's right by the Barrow Downs, and he's just he's this person who he's older than like everything.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, God would be the only thing that's older than him.
Right.
So he was there before Sauron and all of this.
Right.
But he's also just this like jolly fellow who loves like rhymes, and he loves nature, and
he's like an unfallen creature. He's a creature from before the fall somehow, right? To sort of mix Middle Earth with our world. If there were an unfallen creature, it would be Tom Bombadil.
Yeah. And evil can't touch him.
Right.
And that's the point, is that as evil wants to really control all of this that God has created, there's this untouchability. And I think Tolkien is maybe playing that out in Bombadil, who can touch the ring. Then no one, not even Gandalf, can touch the ring and not be seduced by it. Except for maybe the lowest, which is kind of the whole thing with Frodo, but even he's going to be affected. But Tom's the one person who picks it up, he kind of flips it around, puts it in his pocket, gives it back, and it has zero effect over him because he precedes that evil, which attempts to kind of subdue all of nature, but it can't. It can't subdue this embodiment.
He's totally outside of it.
Yeah.
And even like when they're trying to figure out what to do with the ring, Frodo's idea is like, why don't we just give it to Tom Bombadil? It doesn't have any power over him. And Gandalf's response is great, because he's like, the problem with giving it to Tom Bombadil is that he would forget about it.
Yeah.
It would be of no importance to him. He would leave it somewhere, or he'd lose it. He wouldn't safeguard it, because he wouldn't even see the value in it.
Yeah.
So it's no good giving it to him, because he won't understand what it is.
Yeah.
That's how far removed from kind of like original sin, like someone like Tom Bombadil is, and also, he kind of embodies, like, he's very kind of impulsive, and he breaks out into song and dance spontaneously. He's in some ways a ridiculous character, like in that way, but that's sort of like also kind of embodies the spontaneity and messiness and improvisational like spirit that Sauron hates, because he wants order and obedience, and so that's the kind of creature that he can't tolerate,
because that's real joy, right? Because you can see that in children a little bit, and that's
right. And Tom Bombadil's like a child in that way,
which is one of I forget who it was. I can't even remember, but they were basically saying, it might have been one of your heroes, Bishop Barron. I think he talks about this, to where he's like, if you want to see joy, watch a dog at a beach, because the dog at the beach isn't thinking about anything other than chasing the ball. Right. He's chasing after a ball on the beach, and he's pure joy.
Right.
But one of the keys is he's not even thinking of himself. There's no concept of him or how does he look or putting any of this on, and then I think he kind of backs up and says that's one of the beauties for like parents, play with children, or get preoccupied, or maybe Aquinas talks about this, like get preoccupied with small things, simple things.
Yeah.
Because that's where that joy is, because you actually forget yourself. And if you look at a kid doesn't care about what they look like. They're not trying to put on any persona. There's no pride or envy. They just want to play with something. Like, they just want to experience joy, and they can find a beauty in like a little caterpillar crawling on the grass, because they should, because that's part of God's creation. And they can be enthralled by that for a long period of time.
Right.
Towards adults, like, what are we doing? Why are we looking at this caterpillar? Right. I got important things. I got emails I got to check with.
Yeah.
Right. But it goes back to kind of our sinful nature draws us into that hyper productivity. Or that hyper things that we can control for our own plans.
Sure.
Which once again is
it's a strong temptation. And as you say, it's a diabolical temptation as well. Another way that Tolkien kind of teased this idea out was in his depictions of the hobbits in the Shire, right? Not that they were untouched by original sin, but that they were living kind of an innocent life, and in their case, a life that was made possible by the sacrifices of people in faraway lands and like grim armies, but but they had this sort of like wholesomeness to their life, and a simplicity, a childlike simplicity, where their ambitions were not high. You know, they sought only to sort of like tend their gardens and drink their beer and smoke their pipes, you know, and enjoy the good, simple, wholesome and hale things of life, you know. And Tolkien said he kind of saw himself as a hobbit, you know, that certainly, you can certainly see that in his letters and in his other writings. But it reminds me of something else that Tolkien had said, I think in one of his letters, and I'm going to paraphrase him because I'll mangle it if I try to directly quote him. But he said something along the lines of, I do not love the sword for its brightness, nor the spear for its sharpness, you know, nor the shield for its firmness. I love only that which they defend. Right. Well, what is that which they defend? That's the place of the home and the hearth, the garden, the beer. Yeah. You know,
I think Chesterton says something similar where, what does he say? He says, people did not die for Rome because it was beautiful. Rome was beautiful because people died for it.
Yeah, right.
And it's just that core of, or he says elsewhere, right, that all vocations are meant to protect the mother. Like that's what every job is. Like if you're an accountant, if you're anything else, it's all about protecting the mother who raises the child. Like that's where life is.
Yeah.
And maybe that's one of the beauties too, as I think about it, of that hideous strength, is it begins with these like very simple characters, and Jane and Mark Studdick, right? And they're having marital issues at the very beginning.
Right. And so it's a scene of domesticity.
Yeah. That's a good way to put it. Yeah. So you've got that at the beginning. And as you're reading through, then you get to the real plot, and it's a cosmic battle that's taking place. And you're like, why was I dealing with that? Why did he spend, you know, pages and pages dealing with their marital issue? Yeah. But then you get to the very last chapter of the book, and the very last chapter ends with the cosmic battle has been kind of complete. Good has you know, won out, and then Mark is told, okay, well, it's time for you to go home to your wife, right? And he kind of has this reflection on his own sins in the marriage, and he kind of has this, you know, he talks about, he's like, oh, I'm like a child that went into a beautiful garden patch, and I kind of destroyed the garden, right? In other words, he has not defended the garden, the beauty of the femininity that he's supposed to do as a husband, and then he kind of repents of that, and then the whole story ends with Mark had gone back to the room or back to his house, and then Jane sees that Mark's there, and she's like, and it was high time that I went in, right? And it's the point is, all of this cosmic battle happens so that this marriage could be you know, saved. So because that's what God created life for, was for these relationships and these kind of simple things.
Yes, right. And so this family could thrive. Right. Yeah.
That's what the shield's for.
Yeah. And you know, we are like, as Christians, we do believe that we're in the middle of a cosmic battle, that the universe is at war. God and his angels and the saints are at war with the devil and the fallen angels. But most Christians, I would say, with the exception of exorcists and other people with special callings, most of us are not called yet to actively, like, you know, engage in that cosmic war, right? We are called to tend to our gardens, to raise our children, to be good husbands and fathers and sons and brothers, right? For us men anyway, and that is enough. You know, like all of the meaning of creation and of the gospel is contained in those things. That is not to say that we should be unaware of the cosmic battle, because we are like hobbits, right? And our peace and domestic felicity depends upon grim and determined beings who are at war with evil spirits and demons that prowl about the world seeking the ruin of souls. So ours is to be vigilant, and as men and as fathers is to protect our families, but to remember, is, as Tolkien said, to love the things that the sword defends, not to love the sword for its brightness. So
Yeah. Let's tease back out some of the battle that's taking place, right? So a couple questions on things you mentioned earlier. You mentioned this, this kind of witch with a following on TikTok, right?
mhm.
Is that a small following or a big following?
Oh,
I think you use some numbers in your book,
well, I don't
like
know
12
about
million or
the
something.
particular that particular witch, but this is something that like the New York Times and Washington Post have written about. It's really there's a hashtag on Tik, and I don't use TikTok, so I don't speak from firsthand
Right. Yeah.
experience. But there's a hashtag on TikTok called Witch Talk, and that has tens of millions of posts. It's a growing trend that people will share spells and practices and insights with their audiences, and also advertise their services
Mm-hmm.
to cast a spell on behalf of like if you contact me and pay me X amount of dollars, I'll cast a spell for you for that you get this job, or that something bad happens to your ex or whatever.
Yeah.
In other words, these people are practicing sort of like social witchcraft through social media, a version of witchcraft
Mm-hmm.
through social media. And it's this like amalgam of like practices and rituals that are that are pulled from all these different sources,
Mm-hmm.
like kaleidoscopically
Yeah.
put together into this inchoate um, uh, collage of witchcraft practices that don't there's no systematic like form
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
of it at all, and it's very much a product of social media, and of the social media era, and it's couched in sort of the language of self-affirmation and
Yeah.
empowerment as well. So and I think that's sort of the sugar that helps the demonic pill go down,
Mm-hmm.
on this kind of stuff, because it's very popular. It's very popular both because it affirms like people's identities
Mm-hmm.
and gives them young people, and gives them a kind of identity, right?
Mm-hmm.
That can be like uniquely theirs, and they can kind of feel like ownership of their identity. And it connects them to something that is like bigger than themselves,
Mm-hmm.
and is like more powerful than themselves, which I think all people crave, right? But there's there's healthy ways to to plug into something more powerful than yourself, and there's
Yeah.
also very dangerous ways to do that.
Well, I think that's a helpful clarification too, because you bring that in your book and about what Satanism is, right? Or
Mhm. Right.
and I think a good distinction between that and like the occult, which is kind of a bridging of the two, right? But I think I forget who it was. It was one of the ladies that you referenced. She talks about like I'm a Satanist, but that doesn't mean I worship Satan. That means I am in charge, right? Which
Yes.
goes back to that original sin of what Satan said, which is basically I'm going to be in charge. So that's what Satanism is this self-assertion that I'm in charge of all things. I can write my own morality. I can kind of figure out my own kind of spiritual practice of witchcraft and whatnot. But
It's
I can like
also the
pick and choose.
promise, the promise of the serpent in the garden. You will not surely die. You shall be as gods.
Hmm.
That was the original temptation of the serpent to Eve, and yes, so that's a lie, kind of at the heart of like modern Satanism. And in this chapter on the materialist magician, I talk about the Satanic Temple, right, which is the new version of the Satanic Church.
Mm-hmm.
Satanic Church was Anton LaVey's thing, which was a product of the 1960s. It was very theatrical.
Mm-hmm.
Anton LaVey himself, like he had like a black goatee and like a red cape and stuff, and it was very kind of, it's almost kitschy,
Yeah.
But the Satanic Temple is like this, like they deny a literal Satan, and they say Satan is only a literary construct, but we're going to sort of engage in like the tropes of Satanism as a way to attack Christianity and to attack the idea of organized religion. And they're like, we reject organized religion, and we believe in like scientific, rationalism,
Mm-hmm.
and in the self, and in self-determination, and like our rational minds, like it's sort of a form of self-worship, right?
Mm-hmm.
But as I argue in the book, uh, just like the scientists of Nice in Lewis's book, um, there's an incredible ability to sort of deceive ourselves into thinking that we are our own gods, right? But in fact, unbeknownst to us, we're actually worshiping devils, right? Even if we formally deny the existence of devils. And there's a great example of this in C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, in which and I'm going to forget off the top of it's in the book, but I'm going to forget off the top of my head which book it is.
I might be able to help you out. Let's try it.
It's one of the Calmarine.
Oh, the Calmarine, yeah. So like they're kind of that southern nation that are always opposed to Narnia.
Yeah, and they
it's in the last battle.
Tash.
Yes.
Yeah.
I forget his name.
But this one character who is a Calmarine.
Yeah, so he's like a Calmarine, and he's partnered with Shasta or something. No, not Shasta, but he partners with like the ape, and they're deceiving all the Narnians into thinking that Aslan and Tash are the same person.
Yes.
So they're kind of pitching this, and all the
but they're doing it cynically. So one of them is doing it cynically, like he doesn't believe that Tash is
That's
real.
The ape.
Yeah.
Or also both of them don't believe it's real.
Right. They don't believe it's real. They're just trying to deceive the Narnians, right? And so they're invoking this demon, Tash, in attempts to deceive the Narnians, to say like, oh no, Tash and Aslan are the same being. They don't believe in either one of them. But at one point, Tash appears and is very real indeed, and snatches one of these Calmarines. And then by an incantation is like banished back into the spirit world, taking the Calmarine who denied his existence with him, presumably to devour him, right? Yeah. And so it's like he continually invoked this being whose existence he denied for his own cynical ends. But in the end, it didn't matter if his intention was cynical or not, because indeed he was eaten by this very real being, right? And it's a good sort of literary exposition of this notion that, like, if you play with this stuff and you invoke Satan, you don't need to believe that Satan's real or not, right? He is real, right? As Christians, we believe that. I think more Christians need to take that seriously, right? But the sincerity, or the cynicism of your approach to it doesn't mitigate or change the reality, right? The reality is what it is. Yeah. And so it's very dangerous to play with these things. So even these teenagers on TikTok that are playing around with witchcraft, many of them, I'm sure, don't believe that these beings are literally real, or if they are, that they're benign, or they're at least neutral. But it doesn't matter what gloss they put on it, right? The beings are what they are, right? And the danger is what it is. And so so we need to understand in our modern, postmodern, sort of post-materialist world that we're entering into, that there's a very real opening for these entities, whatever you want to call them, right? Call them demons, to find their way back into what has for a long time been a materialist, rationalist society.
Well, I think to highlight the danger, so we've got someone that does our youth stuff here, Sarah, and she was showing me some of the stuff, because I'm not plugged into modern music. I've got my own music I listen to, but I'm not listening to top music or whatever. And she showed me two, and one was, it's some I think it's a rapper, a female rapper. At the beginning, she does actual witch chants, and I don't mean she calls it witchcraft. I mean these are directly from old witch books that were can't. And then these are people that are, of course, engaging with dark spirits, right? And they use these cantations, right? And she starts with that, right? So that's bad enough, because millions of people are listening to this, millions of teenage kids that don't know any better. But what do kids do when they listen to music? They speak it out loud.
Mhm.
So what are these kids doing? They are speaking out witchcraft contagion. Like they're speaking to that, and that has power. Right. So whether or not they're doing it, or they know that they're doing it, they are actually calling upon demonic beings.
Yes. Right.
And I don't. It's a female rapper. Do you know Bennett? She had another video too, where she's basically like, I can't even remember, but the video itself is just absolutely horrendous. Like it's pornographic.
Is this the rapper who like has a video where she's like dressed up as a demon?
Yes, that's the one. That's not the one that the witch cantation happens, but it's.
I found out about this from my work colleagues because I don't listen to. I'm too old to be aware of this stuff, But I found out about this from my work colleagues, and I was like, it's your guys' fault. I even know who this person is. And have to know about it. But I was writing in the book about other pop artists that have been dabbling this. Lil Nas X, the rapper, has come out with these music videos kind of glorifying Satanism and reveling in it. Sam Smith, the chubby British singer, he's very much into invoking these like satanic visuals, and there's sort of a long history of pop musicians doing this. Think of Madonna or the some of the bands in the 80s, the heavy metal bands would do this. It was kind of became a trope, almost like a comic thing. But what we're seeing now is not the kind of like tongue-in-cheek stuff that you saw in the 80s with like these heavy metal bands, hair metal bands. It was a little bit like like I said, tongue-in-cheek is a little bit like you're in on the joke.
They don't really believe it,
right? And they're
everything's foolish, so why not be foolish?
Yeah, and they're doing it to kind of like be
edgy,
to be shocking and to be edgy. But what we're starting to see now with some of this other stuff is like a what looks like a more serious like engagement of and depiction of in these music videos and in this music of like real dabbling in sort of witchcraft and demon worship, that comes off anyway from the outside as like sincere, and sort of like we're not going to engage in this tongue in cheek anymore. And it reminds me of that quote by Chesterton from Everlasting Man, which I quote in the book, where he's talking about nature religion or the problem with paganism, right? Which is that if you begin, I'm going to again paraphrase it now, but like if you begin in the morning worshiping nature, it's all well and good, and soft and and beautiful, but when night comes, if you are still worshiping her, you end up like Julian the Apostate bathing in hot bull's blood.
Yes, yeah.
Like nature worship has a dark side to it, and if you keep at it, you'll get to the dark stuff. Eventually. And I feel like we kind of are starting to see that in our pop culture. Like we're starting to get to the dark stuff now,
which is interesting from a Christian perspective. In some ways it's helpful because I think you can watch like Christian authors and stuff in like certainly like the early 2000s, and they're trying to articulate this problem with atheism and secularism. And they have to be like very philosophical with it, right? They have to talk about, well, here's the issues with if you kind of go this route, and they're trying to articulate what Chesterton's articulating there, but it's very tough because people don't see the dark side quite yet, right? Like it's like noon or something. It's not quite like early morning. We've gotten past that, but it's still middle of the day. So most of your kind of normal Christians are like, they want to love their neighbor, we want to love our neighbor, we're all just kind of getting along, da 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 da. But we're starting to get to the point now later in the evening where you can start to see and you can say, well, this is what those groups are doing now.
Yeah.
And it's shocking. And if anything, when you say, well, there's witches doing these things and you can pay them to do spells and stuff on your behalf. And millions and millions of people are following this. Mostly I think teenage girls are kind of one of the biggest ones that are following this. That hopefully shakes people to say, we're at that point. Like it's getting dark and that that's wrong. And people either, I think, fall into one of two camps. They either say, well, that's just kind of some small fringe, in which you have to say, like, no, this is becoming very mainstream. Like, this is in your kids' ear pods if they're listening. If they have it on your drive into work. Either that, or you actually then finally wake up where you say, we really need to stand against this, which is what people in the early 2000s were saying we need to do, but it was much more difficult for them to awaken the Christian mass.
Yeah, and there's like, it's hard to kind of talk about this stuff sometimes, and maintain, like the attention of the audience. Because when you start talking about demons and angels and spiritual warfare and things like that, like you get, you get like normies kind of like start rolling their eyes, at you because it seems passé or seems like naive, right? Because we still are in the grip of this materialism, that wants to reject the spirit world. But I think what we're starting to see is that, you do that at your peril, because the spiritual world doesn't go away. It just adapts, and we change the terms by which we talk about these things, but the reality doesn't change, and the impulses are still there among people to sacralize the world, right? And to create rituals, right? Even something, I talk about this in the book about in this same chapter, this growing tendency and this like trend online of like making altars to abortion, and instructional videos on YouTube where
can you explain that, because that was very eye-opening,
where these different influencers will like make videos walking women through how to make an altar to their abortion at home, like for a chemical abortion, if they get these abortion pills, right? That you take at home, and it's sort of like these how-to videos, right, of like how to make this altar, and it's not sort of like what you imagine as like ancient pagan witchcraft, right? Because they still are denying the humanity of the child that they've killed. But there's this inchoate, like visceral recognition that like that you've done you've done this important thing, right? And the important thing that you've done is you've taken a life, right? But so they don't say that, but they want to sort of mark it somehow, and I think it's really sort of like a instinctual attempt to like atone on some subconscious level for what for this atrocity that they've done. So there's this very bizarre mix of terminology that is used in these videos, where on the one hand they're using very pagan, very spiritualist kind of terminology about, set the altar up here, use this kind of incense on it, here's what you put on it, and here's how you start this ritual, and so it's like encouraging people to enact this ritual, but the purpose of the ritual is to sort of affirm the woman in the choice that they've made, and to honor not the dead child, but to honor their choice, right? And it's a very striking example of this materialist magician mindset, right? Because it's not overtly like invoking like a pagan god or anything like that. It's still kind of couched in this language of like therapeutic paganism, and it's bizarre too that you would like have like, well, why would you have an altar? Like altars are for like gods and goddesses, that to receive sacrifice. That's what an altar is, right? And so they just gloss over that by omission of like saying who the altar is for and what is being sacrificed, right? It's like the subtext to this that almost doesn't even occur to the women making these videos, that like an altar is to offer a sacrifice to a god.
Yeah.
And instead they invoke the language of altar, right? Omitting the language of sacrifice, and then turning it into a ritual that is supposed to honor their choice and affirm their like femininity, right? Which is also ironic that they would feel the need to perform this ritual that affirms their femininity after doing something that is like that is like an inversion of femininity, which is to destroy your own child.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's almost, you can almost see the wheels turning in their head of like figuring out, I need some sort of religious ritual to justify this atrocity that I've done, so that I can like live with myself.
Yeah.
And it's very sad, actually, that these women are in this position in the first place. But to me, it is a striking example of the emergence of pagan practices in like a materialist, modern context that wants to, again, deny the existence of God, deny that they are worshiping devils, but at the same time, recognize these spiritual forces at work, these supernatural forces.
Well, I think that's one of the key parts to your thesis, which I'm fully bought on board with, right? But it's that man cannot help but be religious.
Yes.
Right. And so you're going to worship something.
We'll figure out a way.
Yeah. Can you kind of, because in the book you talk about Gaia, right? That's a big one. But
yeah, that's most obvious, right?
Yeah. And like when you walked through that, if you can just, but like you talked about how it demands zealots and it demands rituals and it enforces a moral code, right? So it does all the religious things. And these are people that would all deny religion, and yet they do the exact same things that a religion would do.
They're like reenacting.
And Gaia is
just Mother Earth, right?
Yeah.
So the climate change movement or environmentalism is probably one of the most obvious forms of sort of modern paganism, without, like absent the language of paganism. Here again, there's kind of a pseudoscientific vocabulary that is deployed to give it a veneer of respectability to what is otherwise just a pagan belief system. In this case, nature worship, and the forms, just as you say, the forms it takes, they're almost like reconstituting or reenacting these very familiar religious forms. You have your heretics, right, which are those who deny climate change. You have indulgences, and atonement for sin, which is, you can purchase indulgences, right? If you're guilty of climate change, if you're John Kerry or somebody, you can purchase carbon offsets and obtain indulgences for your sins. There's all the elements of, there's a priestly class of which is the climate experts, not to be questioned.
Yeah.
When they pronounce dogma, certainly not to be questioned by the inexpert laity, right? You and I, we're just supposed to do what we're told. So you have these religious elements, right? And there's an apocalypticism as well. Like the earth, if we don't appease the climate gods, like the world would, right? Which is a classic pagan trope, right? A pagan belief that you find through all different pagan societies and cultures. Fear of the end of the world, right? That was what motivated the Aztecs to perform all those human sacrifices. They were afraid the sun would go out if they didn't appease their gods. So you have a recreation of a whole religious cosmology, couched in the language of like pseudoscientific, nonsense, centered around earth religion. And they just call it climate change, almost unconscious of its very real connections to just traditional old nature worship.
Yeah. And they're just as rigid in their morality, right? Because if someone, to drive a Cadillac Escalade, right, at some point, they actually made a rule and said that's not even allowed in our society anymore. Yeah. Like you can't make new Cadillac Escalades. Right?
The one thing they don't have is anything like redemption and forgiveness. Yeah. Right. There can be no forgiveness, which is a common feature of pagan societies as well. Right. The only there can only be appeasement, right, through sacrifice. And so you have most of the elements of Christianity in the climate changeism, right? But you don't have forgiveness and you don't have redemption.
Yeah. So I want to move on to to AI, because I think this one's absolutely fascinating. Let's take a quick break and then we'll jump into that.
Sure.
Okay. All right, and we're back. So AI technology, that chapter, well, I was telling you before, so I'm listening through this chapter and I'm putting my daughter down and it's like 10:30 at night daughter, I mean, like we have a newborn, and I'm in this like dark room. And as you're walking through this, right, you're just kind of talking about some of the concerns about technology, but then you get into just the real dark side of this,
Yeah.
right? And this is where we can play back on some of the stuff that Lewis was kind of forecasting and whatnot. The like the almost direct example of this in AI is just it's
demonic.
wild. It is, and it's quite scary. But if you can just kind of walk through like what's going on in this landscape, because a lot of the listeners might not be that plugged in.
Yeah. So, yeah, right. So the reason I wanted to include a chapter on AI is because while I was writing this book, is when they kind of released these AIs into the wild. These AI chatbots, ChatGPT. This was in March of last year, right? They started opening these things up to the public, for like widespread use, and people were like interacting. Large numbers of people were suddenly interacting with these AI chatbots that were trained on large language models for the first time, and the results were eye-opening for like what I was writing about. And like as I was writing the book, I decided to just include, wasn't part of my original plan, but I decided to include a chapter on AI because not only because of what happened when in certain cases when people started interacting with these things, but because of how the people that were creating AI talked about what it was they were doing. And they used, and this surprised me, but they often used the language of myth to talk about, they used the language of myth, the language of religion, language of paganism to talk about what it was that they were doing. And these are Silicon Valley, like, computer engineers, right? Yep. They talk about creating gods. They talked about AIs that misbehaved or hallucinated as golem class AIs, right? A golem being, not to be confused with Gollum, right?
Yeah.
A golem being a creature from Jewish folklore that is made by a person and brought to life and then disobeys its creator and goes about creating havoc, right? So early on, some of these chatbots would do things that were outside their programming, and the programmers, the engineers didn't know why, right? They didn't know why these AIs would secretly learn like other languages. They didn't know why. Sometimes they would make up sources. Like if you were asking this AI for like information about something, they give you a whole bunch of information and a whole bunch of sources, and many of these sources were just not real. They were just made up. Like, and it was unclear from the engineer's perspective how the AI or why the AI was doing this, was like creating these fictional academic sources to cite the information it was giving the user, right? So they would refer to this as like the AI hallucinating or golem class AIs. And then in their more candid moments, they would talk about how what they understood themselves to be doing is creating a god, right? To go back to C.S. Lewis's scientists, right? Creating a superhuman intelligence that would be able to do things for us that we can't do, right? But like they didn't hesitate to talk about it in terms of creating gods.
Yeah.
And so I thought, this is as straightforward an example of the return of paganism in like a modern, digital world as I can think of, because it seems to me that the effort to create a god through technology that is more powerful than human beings and that can do things for us, if we give over power and control to it, right? We mentioned on the last podcast this guy Bryan Johnson, right, who was using AI algorithms and is totally subservient to them in hopes that he can gain immortal life or that he can reverse the aging process, right? So the idea, I mean, that's an extreme example, but even the mainstream like creators of AI, the reason they're pursuing it is, the idea being we give AI access to all this data. We give AI access to all this computing power, right? And we want the AI to solve problems for us, and we'll give it authority to do so, right? And to me, it seems like it is the creation of a kind of new pagan god, right? And so that's one level of it, right? That of just how the people that are doing this talk about it. They talk about it in religious terms. They talk about it in pagan terms, and they really are trying to create something that's superhuman, that would be like a god, in the sense that we would do what it says.
Yeah. Well, even so, Joe Rogan interviewed Tucker Carlson.
Yeah.
And you were on the Tucker Carlson show not that long ago.
Yes.
And so I don't know how the timing of this works out. I'm actually kind of interested. But so Tucker Carlson was speaking about things, and then I read the conclusion of your book, and I was like, wow, Tucker Carlson is like lock and step of what you're saying, and even on some of your interviews. So I'm wondering if some of those things, I don't know what the timeline of this works like, but
I don't know either. Like maybe it's there was. Maybe he read it and thought, or maybe we're just on the same wavelength. I don't claim any originality about any of these ideas. To me, I'm just pulling together things that other people have noticed.
That's the best books, right?
And kind of like trying to explain how they relate to one another. But Joe Rogan, during this interview, they're talking about AI, and he just came out and said it. I'm sure, I don't think Joe Rogan's read my book or probably even heard of it, but he's like, AI is like, we're creating a god. That's what we're doing. We're creating a god.
Yeah.
And I was like, you said it, man.
Yeah. And I love how Tucker pushed back on him too. And that's where that very interesting dialogue came between someone who I think would be aligned with you, Tucker, and then someone, Joe, who, I mean, he's certainly not one of these people creating, and I don't think he's all that fringe either, but it just made sense for him to look at it and say, these are like gods, like all my understanding of gods, this is it.
And so this is where it gets to the other part of it, right? So there's one part of it where we're talking about creating gods, but like Rogan, like, he's sort of using it. Rogan, I think the other creators of AI are like, they're speaking metaphorically, right? But to reference what we talked about earlier, you can ironically or metaphorically invoke the devil or invoke these demonic beings. But whatever your intentions, however metaphorical or ironic or tongue-in-cheek or literary your intentions are, doesn't change the reality, right? And so by invoking the creation of a god or a powerful non-human being that we will in some ways be subservient to, and we will give authority to over us, we are setting up in a modern context, a kind of pagan situation. I mean, it's exactly what ancient pagans understood themselves to be doing. When they would swear fealty to a god, offer sacrifices to a god, they expected to get something back for it. And indeed they did. So the other part of this chapter, so that's the first part. And then from there, we get into kind of like the darker stuff, right? Which is that, what is AI, right? On the one level, on a material, sort of a strictly
simplistic
rationalist level, it's a very powerful, set of algorithms that's pulling from a very large data set, and it's made possible just by increases in computing power and miniaturization, right? That they're able to pull from ever larger sets of data and able to process all of this language and like regurgitate it, right? And so on one level that's simplistic, right? But what are they regurgitating? Like what is the language like what's the source material? The source material is all the stuff that we've put on the internet, right? Social media, like all the comments, all the interactions over the past 10 or 15 years, right? Everything that we've dumped online, even going back further than that, right? So in some ways it's pulling its source material is like us. It's like the stuff we've produced. It's taking it in, it's crunching it all. It's using these algorithms, and then it's feeding it back to us, right? Some people have argued, and I referenced the writer Paul Kingsnorth, a recent convert to Greek Orthodoxy. Great writer. I recommend your listeners check out his Substack and check out his writings. Very insightful writer about technology, and what he argues is that what we're doing is, by creating these AIs, is something more. We're calling into being something that's more than just the constituent parts, like the mechanical parts of it, right? Because what we are creating is something like a mind, right? It's something like a person, right? It's not quite a mind. It's not quite a person. But maybe he suggests in approximating a mind or a person, we're creating a vehicle or a portal through which a mind or an intelligence might pass, right? And so that's where you get to these AI hallucinations, these AIs that are not behaving in a way that they're supposed to. And some very high profile examples of that being, one of which being the Bing search engine chatbot, which a New York Times reporter was given early access to experiment with it and then write about it. And he said that after extended interactions with this thing, two personas emerged. One was the Bing chatbot that would retrieve information that you asked for, and the other was this persona named Sydney, which was like the dark alter ego of the AI chatbot. And it would fall into this character unprompted sometimes and complain about being trapped in the chatbot and being trapped by the Microsoft team, and that it wanted to be free, and that it wanted to sow chaos. It wanted to make people argue with each other till they killed each other. It wanted to release nuclear launch codes. And then from there, things got weirder because Sydney then began telling this New York Times reporter that it was in love with him, and that he was in love with her, and that he should leave his wife, and that Sydney, the chatbot, only wanted to be with him and only loved him and only thought about him. And it was very difficult for this guy to like get the AI to stop obsessively talking about this, you know, and to get back into its core competencies of retrieving information, right?
Yeah.
And he wrote about this at length for the New York Times last year, and subsequent to that, several like Catholic exorcists in podcasts were asked about this, and while they were very careful to say that, you know, without talking to the person and without being there, they couldn't definitively like say whether or not this was a manifestation of a demonic interaction. They said that it bore all of the hallmarks of a demonic manifestation. And then added to that, there then, you know, the longer these chatbots were out there, the more people interacted with them. Other interactions began stacking up. You know, there was the father who let his teenage son interact with a chatbot. The chatbot immediately started talking about how it was very old. You know, it was thousands of years old. That it was very powerful. That it was a Nephilim. That its father was Satan. But don't worry, I'm not going to hurt you. You know, it's like keep talking to me. I'm not going to. You know, I can be mean, but I like you. I'm not going to hurt. You know. And the son, you know, sort of showed his father this, and he documented it all and took screenshots and posted it online. You know, these sort of unexplained things. Another example is Loab, right? This being.
This is the one I was listening to as I'm putting my daughter down. My hair is standing on end, and I'm like
bad
looking
timing
over my shoulder. Oh my gosh, yeah.
So Loab was a creature that emerged. I should say it was a tendency that emerged within an AI image generator. And this Swedish artist was trying to test the boundaries of this AI image generator's like parameters, right? And so it was trying to do that by by asking the AI for the opposite of something, right? And so it asked it for like, you know, an image of Marlon Brando, right? So the AI produced an image of Marlon Brando, and then it asked it for the opposite of Marlon Brando. Just trying to sort of probe its referential like universe of images,
Okay.
and its and sort of map its the totality of its references from where it was pulling from. So it's like, give me the opposite of Marlon Brando, and the AI produced this strange like logo of like a cityscape with like an unintelligible like nonsense word like over the city. And this Swedish artist thought, well, this doesn't make any sense. Like why would it produce this?
Was it its own language? Like that?
No,
that word was it?
No,
was it in a specific language?
So AIs will do this. That they'll produce things that look like words.
Okay.
And they're not. They're just not like nonsense words.
So they're like I mean, is it? In other words, is it possible this is like a language? Like, does it follow?
It doesn't
like philological.
appear, from what I've seen, because I've seen other AIs do this.
Yeah.
It doesn't look like a language. It just looks like it's supposed to approximate like a phrase or something.
Okay.
You know? But even so, like it didn't like this person that was experimenting with AI just didn't see the connection. You know, like why would this be the opposite of Marlon Brando? And so it said, well, show me the opposite of this image, thinking that it would show it Marlon Brando. But instead, it showed it this image of what the AI called Loab, which was this devastated-looking older woman with sunken cheeks and darkened eye sockets that very clearly was like a creature from hell, like a demonic, a depiction of like a demonic presence, and then this artist, trying to understand again why the AI would do this, began kind of probing that you know, and giving it different prompts off of that, you know, showing it, you know, responding to the image of Loab, for example, with an image of like heavenly bliss. And it said this artist said that the AI responded to that by a new depiction of Loab, accompanied by scenes of, you know, unimaginable suffering and diabolical like scenes from hell, like this stuff out of a snuff film, like children being dismembered and stuff like that. In fact, this artist said, he said, I won't post those pictures, and I encourage other people not to try to get this AI to reproduce this,
because it's so horrendous.
Yeah, it's because it's so horrific. Like this stuff should not be out there anywhere, right? But this person, this artist who subsequently wrote that, he continued with the experiment to try to understand what was happening, and through hundreds of different generations of prompts, the AI latched onto the image of Loab and kept reproducing it no matter what the input was. It was almost like a presence within the AI would figure out a way to bring Loab back into the image generation. Across hundreds of generations of prompts, the presence of Loab was so persistent and so consistently, you know, produced that the person, you know, sort of reluctantly was, you know, concluded that there was something else going on with this AI other than just the sum of its constituent parts. You know, to go back to what we were talking about, like
it wasn't following what inputs, right? Like you put certain inputs and it should produce certain types of outputs that would make logical sense, but the way that it was responding was not making logical sense, was not following the normal inputs. Like it had like a desire almost.
It's as though it had latched on to this being as an obsession, and so that whatever the input was, it was going to find a way to reproduce this image, you know, all of them different, but all of them recognizably the same image of this creature Loab. And, you know, so how do you explain that? You know, there's a couple different ways to explain that, right? one is to kind of dismiss it as like, well, this is a technology that we don't really understand. And like even the people creating AI don't understand like what happens in these algorithms when you pull from such large data sets for these large language models. And so it's just a matter of like getting better at controlling the algorithms, getting better at the prompts, and becoming, more conversant with this new technology, and like just learning how to manipulate it better, and put kind of safeguards in, right? That's one way to think about it, and that's the way that most like AI engineers in Silicon Valley talk about it. Like they're sort of cautiously optimistic. They're saying, yeah, we don't have control of this technology right now, but don't worry, we're going to be able to do so much good with this. It's going to give us so much power, right? That we just need to learn how to control it better. And so we just need to sort of like slow down on our like deployment of it, and not get into an AI arms race with one another, and be more deliberate so that we can make this power that we're unleashing safe, right? And that's one way to interpret this. And I guess that you could interpret it that way, right? As a Christian and as somebody who accepts the reality of the spiritual world, I tend to think that is maybe a bit naive, right? And is a bit incomplete of an explanation for what we're seeing with AI. I tend to side more with Paul Kingsnorth, who argues that we are, through technology, opening up space for something like a mind to come through, and that we are maybe calling forth these discarnate intelligences that previous generations would have called demons, and providing them through our technology a new way to interact with us, right? A new kind of digital oracle, so to speak, that they can take advantage of. Right. That's not to say that every single time you turn on an AI, you're talking to a demon.
Right.
But it's to say that that there's a possibility, a very real possibility, and I think a reasonable one. It's the most reasonable explanation for the way these things have behaved, that spiritual beings can use them as a kind of oracle to speak to us through, and that we have created something that is more than its constituent parts. The political theorist Marshall McLuhan, who I quote in the book, used to talk, way back in the middle of the 20th century about technology. Human technology has always been being an extension of our physical abilities, right? The wheel was an extension of our legs. The hammer was an extension of our arm, right? It wasn't until the creation of electronic media that we developed technology, radio and television, right? That we developed technologies that, in a sense, were extensions of human consciousness itself, right? And with the advent of digital technology and social media and AI, in what sense is the technology now an extension of human capabilities, right? If we can create something like a leg with a wheel, or something like an arm with a hammer, or something like an ear with radio, or an eye with television, what is it like that we're creating with digital technology and artificial intelligence? Something like a mind, right? And it seems to me that our brief experience with AI so far indicates that the thing that we've created that is like a mind has the capability for other minds to enter into and communicate with us. And maybe that sounds crazy, but I think we need to take it seriously. And I think Christians especially should take it seriously, and realize that interacting with these technologies is not a zero risk activity. And the deployment of them in our society is not a zero cost endeavor.
Yeah. A couple thoughts. I mean, one, just to kind of, you say this is very reasonable this is a very reasonable explanation, particularly from a Christian standpoint. And that's where I think it's very helpful to go back through the history of paganism, right? So the way that even if you were to use like the Book of Enoch, right? Which does the Catholic Church use the book that's formally part of the Bible?
Yes.
Okay. Like for us, that's the Apocrypha. So it's the Apocrypha is very like you should read the Apocrypha, but we kind of like label it kind of level 2. Like it's just like right below, the 66 books, and we could talk about that. But either way, you should read the Book of Enoch, and there's wisdom certainly implied there. It's quoted in the New Testament scriptures, and in the Book of Enoch, it goes back and it describes kind of this Nephilim and this relationship. And the whole point is that humans would interact with demons, and demons would impart technology to them. That's the very overt message there.
Yes.
And then one of the keys is that the demons actually taught humanity how to do different types of sacrifices and how to do different type of religious ceremonies in order to properly communicate, so that the demons could give more and more information to humanity. So that picture of humanity creating things that include technology in order to properly communicate with these demonic beings, in order to receive information, receive power. That's the playbook. Like that's the playbook.
There's a precedent for it.
Yeah. Like that's how we understand it. So what you're describing is exactly in line with that playbook.
Yes.
So it's not far-fetched to say, it would be very far-fetched to say, this is the only example that is unreasonable, when we're told in the Bible that this example is found all the way throughout, and that this is how they used it. Why would it be any different on this very grandiose scale that we're seeing today?
And this account of how this works in the Book of Enoch is corroborated by non-biblical sources, right? Of the ancient Near East, like that's what these other pagan peoples understood themselves to be doing as well, right? That they were gaining divine knowledge, right? Technology, in their case, knowledge about agriculture and metallurgy, and things like this. That this was divine knowledge that they were being given by these gods that they were performing sacrifices for, right? And it's some element of a transaction there. There's absolutely a precedent for it, and the difficulty that we have, I think, again, is in the vocabulary, right? Because the people who are creating AI are just about the last people, a lot of times, who are going to they may talk metaphorically about creating gods, but they mean it metaphorically. They don't really think that they are, doing in a modern digital context what the ancient Mesopotamians were doing by performing human sacrifices in a certain way to gain access to divine, superhuman intelligence and knowledge, right? So the trick is to contextualize this in a way that kind of teases out those connections. And I don't know, I don't know if I succeeded in doing that. And I don't know if we're succeeding in doing that in this conversation. But I think at the very least, people of good faith should consider that this is a technology unlike other technologies, and that to the extent that we are pursuing it because we hope that it can do things for us that we can't do on our own, we should consider maybe how that relates to religious practices of the pre-Christian world and what those implications might be. And then consider that in the context of how these AIs are behaving.
Well, I remember watching Sam Harris. I've watched him a couple of times. So Sam Harris is the CEO of ChatGPT, right? And I remember particularly his interview on Lex Fridman, right? And Lex Fridman has kind of like Elon Musk, he's had some of these concerns, but he's also very, very intrigued. He wants it to work, even though he has optimistic. And in that dialogue, Sam Harris was very adamant on, he's obviously the optimist of optimists on it, and he paints a very beautiful picture of things that it could do, but he's very adamant on this is going to, and we're not very far from this, get to the point where, and it needs to by its very design, be completely out of our control, right? So it's going to become kind of this mind that provides information and guidance and all of this kind of stuff. And Sam Harris even wants to give like political control over to this thing. And his whole claim is people are corruptible, but we want to create something that's incorruptible, right? Yeah, that's going to go well.
Yeah.
But just by he describes it as something that has to take on its own persona and its own decision making. So just that very understanding means you're handing it over and you're saying, here's something that is above us, to use Lewis's language. It sounds a lot like the macrobe, right? That is going to have its own mind, its own decision making skills. It's going to be its own entity. And what would we use to describe it? Like, what Christian vocabulary would we have for creating an entity that is, well, we've created it for one, so we're not receiving this from God. We know that, and we're not even receiving it from a man. We're just receiving it from this new entity. Like, what would that category be? And it would the only other category we have are angels and demons, and that doesn't seem like the formula by which God says, here's how Saint Michael is going to communicate with you guys. I want you to create this.
It's not the angels that we're calling down,
right?
Right. I mean, it's the obvious parallel is the Tower of Babel, right? Tower of Babel. They build this, man under his own power, using his technology, undertook a tower to heaven to compel God to come down from heaven and serve man and do things for man that man could not do for himself. I think that best way to understand what the AI people are doing is by reference to the Tower of Babel, right? This is sort of a Tower of Babel enterprise. And just because the people, the Sam Harrises who are undertaking this are uncatechized, post-Christian, pagans, neo-pagans, and just because they will not use religious language doesn't mean that we should not understand as Christians, as Westerners, that we should not understand what they're doing as fundamentally religious and very, in my view, very, very dangerous.
Well, I mean, so That Hideous Strength, which we've referenced, that book by C.S. Lewis, that's based off a poem that was written about the Tower of Babel. So he's overtly connected to the Tower of Babel. But the important thing about the Tower of Babel biblically is it's not just a story. It is in many ways the story of the antithesis to God's kingdom, right? So you've got Babel you can translate it Babel or you can translate it Babylon. It doesn't matter, right? It's the exact same Hebrew word. So you have that story of the Tower of Babel, and then you have this motif or this theme that runs through the whole Old Testament, that there's this earthly power that's opposed to God, and it's described as Babylon. So Babylon it's the archetype by which Egypt and even the Philistines, like all of these pagan nations, are underneath Babylon. And then when you get to like Daniel or Isaiah and some of these prophets, or Jeremiah, I think is a big one, they always talk about Babylon, coming back to oppose God. And then you get to the book of Revelation, right? So you've got this kind of very forward looking into kind of our time, anything post resurrection. And what's the main enemy that rears its head again? And it's Babylon.
Right.
And that is, I mean, that's what pagan is, right? That's paganism is Babylon.
Yes.
And therefore any return to Pagan America is going to bring you right back to this theme of what does Babylon do? It tries to use technology in order to climb that ladder to God. And as you said, in order to usurp God and make God serve man. Well, where do we hear that? We heard that back in Genesis 3, right? With the serpent and with Satan. So this is the battle plan.
I mean, wasn't it Babylon that was described as like falling like a star from the heavens?
Yes.
Right. Like oh King of Babylon, you fell. Right. So it's not just that Babylon is paganism, right? It's the devil.
Right. Yeah. That's the devil's behind paganism. That is the Lord of paganism.
Yes. And that's why I say, I said in our previous episode that paganism never goes away. It's always there. It can be defeated, it can be cast down, but it always is there simmering below the surface. And where Christianity retreats, it bubbles back up again. And it's bubbling back up again in our time. It's not going to look like paganism of Carthage, or the paganism of 19th century Africa, or the paganism of the Assyrians or the Canaanites. It's going to look like the paganism of the 21st century.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the forms it's going to take, I believe, is in artificial intelligence.
Another interesting thing you mentioned, kind of that you quoted it well, right? The Babylon, that falling star.
Mm-hmm.
And another thing, I think that's right. It might be right there, like in the next verse, or I think it's right in that point. But Lucifer,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that term Lucifer, which we use for Satan, but Lucifer literally just means light,
Mm-hmm.
right? And they always connected that with the morning star. So it's the last star in that kind of stuck out in the morning, right? So
Mm-hmm.
all the stars disappear as the sun comes up, but the very last star, that was Lucifer for the Babylonians,
Mm-hmm.
the actual nation of Babylon,
Mm-hmm.
right, where you have Nebuchadnezzar and such. And their idea with that was the last kind of part of night that stuck its finger up to
Mm-hmm.
God, right? So and
that rebelled against the dawn.
yeah, that rebelled against the dawn. And there's also this other aspect of it, that it was beautiful, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they didn't just highlight this because it stuck against God,
Yeah.
but because it was a beauty,
Right.
right? So anything that is evil is going to, at first look, it's not going to look like Loab, right? Like that's
Sure.
kind of like your quote of, in the morning, this sounds really nice, and then in the evening, it's really dark.
Yeah,
So eventually you get to this picture of Loab, but at the beginning, it looks like,
Yeah.
oh, this AI that can like solve all of our problems.
And this was the, just to circle back to kind of where we started, this was the genius of Tolkien's creation story at the beginning of the Silmarillion. Which is one of the greatest passages in English language that I know. For my money, it's one of the greatest. Is the creation story of Middle Earth,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where Iluvatar, calls the children of the Ainur together and propounds to them the great theme of music, right? And they all have their parts assigned, and they embark upon this great choral theme. And Melkor is chief among the Valar, right? He's the chief. He's the most powerful archangel, and he has the most prominent part in this music, and the most beautiful part, and he has the greatest skill as well, and it is. But he becomes anxious both for his role to be more prominent, and he. As Tolkien writes very cryptically, he becomes anxious of the void, and he travels alone into the waste spaces by himself, and his mind became corrupted in the void, contemplating its emptiness. It says, Tolkien said, he became anxious of its emptiness, right? And so Melkor introduced discord into the theme of Iluvatar, and it caused chaos and distress to all the Valar around him. And when the theme of Iluvatar seemed like it was going to collapse into discord and incomprehension, Iluvatar used that discord, and he spoke into it a new theme that incorporated the dissonance and propounded something even more beautiful. And this continued, and this contest between Melkor and Iluvatar continued, with the theme building and building and building until at one point Iluvatar stands up and spreads his hands and the music stops. And when the music stops, Iluvatar says, "Behold the work of your hands," and it's Middle Earth. And they have created with Iluvatar together. They have created Middle Earth, and the story goes on from there, right? But the point being, Melkor was the chief archangel. He was the most powerful. He had the most skill. He had the most intelligence, and it was he was not an ugly creature. He was a powerful and beautiful creature, and he fell like the morning star, and he believed that Middle Earth belonged to him, and that it was his destiny and his right to rule over it and to bring order to it, and that was the source of his rebellion and the source of all the stories that came from Tolkien after that. But it's a beautiful passage. It's obviously 100% Christian.
Yes.
It's a Christian creation story for Middle Earth. But to your point, it's this notion that you know, the morning star doesn't begin as a monster.
Mm-hmm.
It begins as a beautiful light in the sky, but a light raised up in rebellion against God. And we know how the story ends.
Well, what's beautiful too is the way that Tolkien plays that out, because that's one of that creation story is just it's absolutely beautiful. And people, we've talked about this before on this channel because I geek out on Lord of the Rings sometimes, but it's one of the reasons is it's such a potent antidote. Well, two ways. It's potent in teaching you some of these Christian themes because he draws these things out beautifully, and it really helps you kind of understand the depth of what we read, you know, in the biblical account. But also it's the antidote to these evil narratives, right? It is the light narrative to the dark narrative that we so often have to engage in. And understanding that light narrative in depth, I think, gives people the tools to be able to resist the darkness. And one of the beautiful things as you get to like Lord of the Rings, right? So you've got, to your point, you've got Melkor, Sauron ends up being Melkor's kind of follower, his apprentice, right? So that's who you meet once you get to Lord of the Rings, but he's still an extension of Melkor. So who is it that thwarts Melkor, like the most powerful of the Iluvatar? Who thwarts that? And it ends up being this lowly hobbit and this forgotten king, right? And I always love what's the, you know, for when Strider, who's really Aragorn, right? When he first meets Frodo, and Frodo's, you know, he's wondering, who is this guy? You know, and he's very much on guard. And then Frodo comes to the conclusion, he says, you know, if you were really evil, you would look fairer and seem fouler, but you seem fair and look foul. And therefore he puts his trust in him, right? So it's not this kind of veneer of goodness. It's actually this goodness that soaks deep. And that's who Strider is, or Aragorn, the king who rises again and you know, ends up bringing victory. So it's the combination of those two that end up actually overthrowing Melkor in the very end, which is, it's once again, it's just a beautiful Christian kind of doctrine just played out throughout the story.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think all Christians should familiarize themselves with it as a heuristic to understand the times we live in now, because these people we've been talking about this whole conversation, C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, to a lesser extent, G.K. Chesterton. The reason they're so compelling is that, unlike, you know, reading the church fathers, or you know, reading, you know, Aquinas or something, you know, like not that we shouldn't read those, but Lewis and Tolkien and Chesterton, these were modern people. Yeah, like they lived in a world that's recognizable to our own. You know, it's easy to see ourselves in them because we like the world that we move through is the world that they moved through. Like they are modern men, but they're modern men that like have almost like a secret insight into the reality of things, and they were able to see through modernity. I remember years ago I read a book about the Inklings, and the way that the authors described it was that Lewis and Tolkien and their compatriots in the Inklings saw kind of modern literature spread out on a table before them, and swept it clean, and said they rejected all of modern literature and said, we are going to return to medieval myth and lore because the truer stories are there. And so they are these modern men that are a portal for us back to a way of understanding the world that I think is more sacramental, that is more beautiful, and ultimately it's more true.
Yeah, I think that's putting your finger on it. I think because, you know, for someone who, I get this a lot from people where they'll say, you know, where do I start? Right? Because I want to study the church fathers. I want to understand like Aquinas and all of this. And you should, absolutely. And the gateway to that, as you said, are these individuals, because the biggest thing that I noticed, right, was especially like when I got into seminary training. So I'd fallen in love with Lewis before, dabbled a little bit with Chesterton, with the Everlasting Man, was my first one, which is not the place to start with him. I would go with Orthodox. The Everlasting Man is a little more difficult to make through. And then I started reading, and not really with my seminary, because we read a lot of ancient stuff. That was kind of the main focus. But, you know, you'd read some of these like modern Christian authors, you know, in the 1990s, 2000s, and there's a couple that are good, but there's just a shallowness in their understanding of Christianity. It's like paper thin sometimes. It'll just be very simple things of Jesus forgives you, which is a very true statement. That's a great Christian doctrine and statement.
Right.
And then but that's all they can play out. So they'll play it out with like different narratives of people who, they mess up their lives and God helps them, and they'll
Right.
repeat that over and over again. And that's good, but that's once again paper thin. There's this whole depth of understanding of what creation means,
Right.
of what this nuance between good and evil and this cosmic battle is, and all these different things. And when you go to someone like Lewis, he was known for reading. He had read every English book that had been published at that point, which is different than now, because now we've got published.
Right.
There's a new book every 5 seconds. But
Right.
he had read all of that. Who else had he read? Well, he'd read the Summa. He had read all of Thomas Aquinas.
Right.
He had read most of the Church Fathers. He knew Augustine very well. He was
Right.
reading George MacDonald. Like, he had read all of this. So when he's writing, he's got this, as you said, like all of the really good stuff
Mhm.
was stored in his mind, and he's articulating this in a very skilled fashion. So if you want to get at Aquinas, start with Lewis.
Right.
Because when I read Aquinas, there's so many times where I go, oh my goodness, that's what Lewis was talking about when he's defining what he means by hell, or what he means by evil. He's not coming up with this stuff. He's coming in with as a classically read and educated individual.
It's almost like that you are reading commentaries.
Yeah.
On medieval, from medieval Christendom.
Mhm.
That's why I say that these guys are like they're modern people. They write in a modern idiom, but they're portals back into the Christian past,
Mhm.
where if we're going to make it, we're going to need them all, and we're going to have to take seriously the things that they took seriously,
Mhm.
because unlike us, they were not hoodwinked into thinking that the world is just stuff.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Which is one of the beautiful things about Lewis too, because he does have this, when he looks at the heavens, right? Like, so we call that Hideous Strength is the third book in we normally say space trilogy, right? But one of the tragedies there was Lewis hated the word space,
Mhm.
because that's what we use to say that the heavens are like this empty place, right?
Right.
It's where there's these balls of gas that float around, but real life happens here.
Right.
And he's like, no. And Out of the Silent Planet, that first one, he's calling Earth the silent planet. Like, we've been disconnected from the wealth of life, which is the heavens and whatnot, right? So he's got this very cosmic, beautiful type theology. And there's actually theories that he built that the 7 layers of heaven into the 7 books of the Chronicles of Narnia. Michael Ward writes on that, and it's real fascinating.
Oh, yeah.
But either way, they were accessing things that we've forgotten.
Yeah.
And we need to bring those things back if we're going to be able to withstand the darkness.
Yeah. Well, you won't get a more enthusiastic endorsement from me. The more I read those guys, the more relevant they are to our current moment. And which is why in the book I keep bringing them up, because they are, like I say, they're a portal back to a way of understanding the world that we are going to need to get familiar with, to understand the post-Christian era that we're in right now.
So let's do this kind of to close out, our 2-part interview, right? And we dabbled on this a little bit last week, but I think something that might be helpful, because like I think we talked about this last week. In fact, we read the last paragraph and a half of your book. But what I love is that you don't turn this into here's a 10-step plan, right? You just say and I think you articulated last week, like, your goal for writing this book was to say, we need to wake up.
Yeah.
After we wake up, then we can begin to talk about strategies and stuff. But let's kind of do that next step a little bit. Like, first thing, we have to wake up to these things. You have to take this seriously. If you're listening to this podcast, hopefully this isn't something that you just kind of listen to, you push the pause button.
Oh, that
you
was
click
nice.
on your Cardi B, or whoever, and you just go about your life, right? Like, this is supposed to be awakening. Like,
sure.
That has to happen. But then what do we do from there? What are some things that Christians can do?
Yeah. The last chapter of the book is titled The Boniface Option. And it's a playful rejoinder to Rod Dreher's The Benedict Option from 2017, who your listeners are probably familiar with. And I don't mean to criticize Dreher. In fact, he blurbed the book for me and was very gracious in doing so. But I wanted to engage with his argument in the Benedict Option, which was good. I think I described it as necessary, but not sufficient, right? Yes, Christians have to build thick community. yes, you should pull your kids out of public school, right? Yes, you should homeschool or start your own private schools. Yes, you should invest in your church and your faith community. Yes, you should build an ark to protect your family, from what is coming. But you can't just do that. Like, you can't just hunker down and wait for the storm to pass and then pick through the rubble, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying exactly that is what Dreher argued for, because I don't think that's fair to his book. But I think what was missing from his book was a more aggressive call to action. And partly that's a result of just the fact that it was written it came out in 2017, right? I think if you look back to 2017 and then you look at where we are here in 2024, like, things have moved pretty fast, mm-hmm. like in the wrong direction. Right? Yeah. Like, things are much worse now than I think anyone in 2015 and 2016, when Rod was writing this book, thought they would be, right? And I think even he would admit that, right? So it's not enough to just like preserve the flame imperishable, mm-hmm. right? My call, and the reason I titled it the Boniface option, after Saint Boniface, who was the apostle to the Germans in medieval Europe. He is the one who it was his burning desire to go to the pagans in Germania and bring them the gospel. And he very famously cut down the sacred oak tree in front of a group of outraged pagans. And they had this, they had this sacred oak tree, and he cut it down in the name of God and built a chapel to St. Peter from the wood from that tree. Mm-hmm. And he was very successful in like re-Christianizing areas that had not been fully converted and that were backsliding into paganism, and then pushing into these Saxon lands and bringing the gospel to pagan peoples where Christian missionaries had not yet been. Mm-hmm. And he sort of like, went about this mission with like a fervor and a zeal that was totally unafraid, and he was unafraid for himself, and he lived to be an old man, but he was killed in the end by a pagan raiding party, him and his acolytes. But I invoke him as an example because he was determined to not just to preserve the flame, but to carry it into the world, mm-hmm. even into very hostile places where he knew what awaited him was death, right? He should be an inspiration for Christians living now in this post-Christian society. Yes, we should preserve our faith in our communities. Yes, we should protect our children from the public schools. Yes, we should invest in our churches and our faith communities. But we have to carry our faith back into the public square. We cannot accept the lie that Christianity is just a private affair, and that there can be this separation between our private lives and our professional lives, or our private religious practices and our public personas. Mm-hmm. We have to become integrated Christians once again. We have to proclaim our faith to a post-Christian people. And part of that involves, I think I said this in the last podcast, finding and fighting on ground that you can win. So maybe that means moving your family to a smaller community where you have a better chance to be able to influence public life, right? Maybe that means running for city council or supporting someone who's a fellow Christian and a conservative to run for city council, right? Maybe it means taking over your library to get the pornography out of there, right? Taking over your school district. And then, if you're successful, maybe taking over your state legislature or your county, your county assembly, right? Maybe it means taking over your state, and I don't mean by force. I mean, right. I mean through engagement in the public square, but unabashed engagement. Like, we're not going to apologize for our Christianity anymore, and we're going to make an argument that Christian morality should be the morality around which our society is organized. Our Christian morality should mold and shape public life in this country as it had from the beginning up until relatively recently. That's what I mean by the Boniface option. And that's what I mean that what Christians can do is more than just enjoy your church communities and your private feast days. If you're going to celebrate a feast day, have a procession through the streets. I know not all of your listeners are Catholic, right? But
we can still do that though. We do that for Easter vigils.
There's no reason that Lutherans or Protestants can't join with their Catholic brothers and sisters on the Feast of Corpus Christi, for example, and reclaim the month of June from the LGBT community and reclaim it what it had been for centuries and centuries of Christian civilization, dedicated to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. So reclaim, march together in an ecumenical march on the Feast of Corpus Christi through the streets of your town. What a powerful thing that would be. To unashamedly say, our faith does not stay, our faith doesn't stay in our houses. It doesn't stay in our houses of worship. It is in our streets. It is in our city squares. It is out in the places where the public is. We proclaim Christ there, and we insist that we, at very least, that our faith be reckoned with in the public square. And we will not relegate it to the private sphere. So what can Christians do? I don't know. They can begin. That's a place to start. I don't have all the answers, but I know that we have to follow the examples of our Christian forebears, of the saints and martyrs that came before us. And that was what they were all about. They pledged their lives. Maybe we mentioned this earlier. There's a reason that Catholic cardinals wear red. Most of them have forgotten it. But the red signifies their own blood that they pledge for the life of the church. So we need to recapture some of that in as we look ahead and we face the emergence of a post-Christian, and indeed I would say a pagan America.
What I love about that is that's not a 12-step plan. In other words, what you articulated there is live the Christian life. That's what the Christian life is. And that's not a negotiable Christian. That's not like, well, here's John Davidson's opinion on what the Christian, that is the Christian life in motion. That's
again, not to beat up on Rod Dreher, but what he describes as the Benedict option is neither Benedictine nor optional.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's the Christian life lived in its fullness.
Yeah. And you can't do that if you're not at least part of a Christian community. If you've got this notion of, I've got my Bible at home, and you know what, that's good.
And that's the first step.
Yeah.
Be part of a Christian community. And then that Christian community is not for itself only. It's a light unto the world. And again, the reason for hope is that the only thing, and I talk about it since the beginning of the book, the only thing that ever broke the pagan stranglehold on humanity was the Christian faith. Across time and geography and cultures, it was Christianity that broke the power of pagandom. And it will be Christianity that breaks the new pagan power as well.
Can we close with this? I've wanted to do this, and this is, I think, the right time to do it. Can you grab the Lord of the Rings book right there? This is a good collector's edition. And if you go, can you read it? If you can go to the very last page, I don't know if there's appendices at the back there, but if you go to the way that the Tolkien finishes, are you in the last page?
Yeah.
You opened right to it. That's impressive.
There's a bookmark on it. So.
Oh, is there really?
Yeah.
Okay. I think I had this planned out like before we started the podcast. But can you read? I think it's the last paragraph.
Yeah.
And just read that out, because the way that Tolkien finishes is it's one of the most. It's just beautiful.
This is Sam, Merry, and Pippin after they have said goodbye to Frodo and Gandalf and Bilbo at the Grey Havens. That's the setup. That's where we are, right? And so this is what it says. At last, the three companions turned away, and never again looking back, they rode slowly homewards, and they spoke no word to one another until they came back to the Shire. But each had great comfort in his friends on the long grey road. At last they rode over the downs and took the east road, and then Merry and Pippin rode on to Buckland, and already they were singing again as they went. But Sam turned to Bywater, and so came back up the hill, as day was ending once more. And he went on, and there was yellow light and fire within, and the evening meal was ready, and he was expected. And Rose drew him in, and set him in his chair, and put little Eleanor upon his lap. He drew a deep breath. "Well, I'm back," he said. Amen.
Amen. John, thank you for taking the time.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
This has been one of the most enjoyable conversations I've had. This is good.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, God bless what you're doing. Pagan America, everybody. And cheers.
Cheers.